pay for tax cuts for the richest man on earth, the GOP is throwing our veterans under the bus.
The entire world watched President Trump powerfully lay out how he's renewing the American dream.
And let's be clear, these policies only create sanctuary for criminals.
The false narrative is that immigrants in general are criminals, or immigrants in general cause all sorts of danger and harm.
Hello, everyone. I'm Major Garrett in Washington. Tonight on America Decides, guess what? We have some numbers for you, and I think you'll enjoy them. 50. That's the number of minutes President Trump and Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau spent talking on the phone today about tariffs. The president called this conversation, quote, constructive. Next number, 30. That's the number of days the president will delay tariffs on cars and auto parts from Mexico and Canada. We'll hear from the head of the provincial government in Ontario, that's in Canada, as you might well know, that produces the most auto parts, what he thinks about this particular delay. And 100, that's another number. That is the length of the president's address to Congress in minutes. It was, by that measure, the longest formal address to a joint session of Congress in the modern era. And in it, President Trump again sounded very tough and aggressive on tariffs and on his efforts with Elon Musk to shrink the size of the federal workforce. I want to start tonight with Olivia Rinaldi and Caitlin Huey-Burns. Olivia is at the White House. Caitlin is on Capitol Hill. Olivia, let me start with you. I know you remember this from the president's address last night, but he talked about tariffs at some length. Let's play one part of that conversation he had with Congress and the rest of the world. Let's listen.
Other countries have used tariffs against us for decades, and now it's our turn to start using them against those other countries. On average, the European Union, China, Brazil, India, Mexico, and Canada, have you heard of them? And countless other nations charge us tremendously higher tariffs than we charge them. It's very unfair.
And yet, Olivia, today there was some reassessment of that, and exemptions were imposed to protect certain economic sectors from these tariffs. What can you tell us?
Yeah, there certainly was a change in tone today, Major, here at the White House. Caroline Leavitt, the White House press secretary, announced that after speaking with the heads of the big three automakers, Stellantis, Ford, and General Motors, there will be a 1-month pause on any auto tariffs coming across Mexico and Canada. Now, she said this came as a request from those big three. They had a conversation with Trump yesterday. We know that that happened before his State of the Union. And as a result, there is a 1-month pause on their tariffs. And I do want to underscore how important this is, because we think of the auto industry and we think of made in America cars, but that's not exactly quite right. A lot of these parts are made in Canada and Mexico, and they flow freely across the U.S.-Mexico border, U.S.-Canada border, assembled here perhaps, and then sold as a made in America car. The problem, though, was with these tariffs, these 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada, a lot of the trade that's happening between these trucks to make these automobiles, they're going across the border multiple times a day. So now you have compounding effects of tariffs where then being passed on to the consumer. Some estimates found that gas-powered cars, the cost of them could go up $3,000 under these tariffs. Also found that electric vehicle-powered cars could go up $12,000 under these tariffs. Now, that wouldn't be immediate. Of course, it would be within the next 6 to 9 months. They have to bake in these prices, but it certainly would have been felt by these consumers who would be buying these new cars. So there was a carve out today for the auto industry, but I do want to note one last thing that Vice President Vance actually just said when he was at the border, and he was asked, look, the auto industry got a carve out on these tariffs. What about other industries? Is there anyone else you're looking at? He just said that there are a number of industries that have also reached out to the White House asking for these exemptions. However, Trump doesn't want 500 different industries getting 500 different carve out. So businesses are already seeing the impact of, hey, the auto industry was able to get out of this for at least a month. What about us? So you're starting to see some pushback from businesses specifically on these tariffs.
Olivia, thank you very much for that. Caitlin, I want to talk to you about what Olivia just summarized, which is this carve out for the auto parts and auto makers. because, in part, the Trump administration knows that the USMCA, the trade deal it negotiated in its first term with Canada and Mexico, creates protections for these industries. And they can bring a claim against this administration for violating the very treaty that it negotiated. And other industries could do the same. Yes, I know the vice president just said, according to Olivia's excellent reporting, that they don't want to have 500 different carve-outs, but there's reason for these industries to say, hey, wait a minute. You put together a whole roadmap for trade between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, and you're the one violating your own negotiated trade pact. I'm sure that was part of the post-address conversation on the Hill today.
Well, it's interesting, Major, because as Olivia was describing that, I was thinking that there are a lot of lawmakers here on Capitol Hill wanting carve-outs as well. They're very nervous about what this would look like. They are giving the president lots of room and latitude, to use their words, to make these kinds of deals, hoping that in the long run it's better for their constituents and for American workers. But there is no doubt they are worried, and they are trying to raise some of these concerns. I mean, they're looking at the stock market like everybody else. They're looking at what Olivia just described, these possibilities that could be passed on to constituents, and especially those in heavy manufacturing states, big farming states, and others, you know, concerned about their own industries in their states and their constituents as well. So they're happy to give the president some room here, and they like to say that, look, he's just trying to make a deal. This has all, though, been hypothetical for them up until now. Over the course of the past several months, they know that Trump has talked about the way in which he wants to use tariffs. Now that he's actually using them, that introduces a new dynamic up here on Capitol Hill. And we've seen the president really test his party when it comes to issues like this. And, Major, I was thinking last night, something else that actually caught members off guard is the way in which he said, talked about trying to get rid of the CHIPS Act, a bipartisan piece of legislation passed here on Capitol Hill with the support of 17 Republicans, signed by President Biden, in a way to increase chips manufacturing here in the U.S. That caught many members off guard, and they're seeking clarification on that as well. So the sentiment up here on Capitol Hill is, can there be chances for waivers on these sorts of things? How far is the president actually going to go? And what kind of leverage can they exert?
Olivia Rinaldi at the White House. Caitlin Huey-Burns on Capitol Hill. Thank you very much. New CBS News polling is giving President Trump's speech last night at least a qualified endorsement. But we should note that viewership of these speeches, historically, is often much higher among those who identify with the president's political party. Here to break it all down, CBS News Executive Director of Elections and Surveys, your friend and mine, Anthony Salvanto. Anthony, tell us what you know.
More numbers, Major, right here. This is the big one that starts it off. The people who watched the speech liked what they heard. 76% approved of it. Now, you mentioned the top, and it is important context. We live in a very partisan era, and when a president is in the White House, his partisans are more likely to watch a speech like this. Last night was no exception to that. The bulk of folks who did tune in were Republicans. Okay, so they were maybe inclined to like what they heard, but they did. In fact, I will show you these descriptors that they used. They called him presidential in giving the speech, even entertaining, and almost as many said inspiring. What we do as we go forward is, for the folks who didn't tune in, who hear about it, programs like this, other sources, how does that play out? How do they react? That's an answer. That's a question to be answered in the coming days.
Anthony, you might be very angry with me because I'm about to ask you something I don't know the answer to. I don't even have any sense at all. And if I'm leading you astray, just get mad at me on live television, okay? I saw the independents who watched. Do we have any sense in the data of what independents thought about the speech?
We do, and they approved, not to the extent that the Republicans did, but I do want to highlight this because it comes to the point about independents. When you take a look at the particular issues, a lot of folks across party lines like the idea of finding waste in government spending. Also, he gets, across all Americans, positive approval for his handling of immigration and the border. But you all have been talking about tariffs. Comparably, although still a majority, comparably, those numbers were lower among things that people liked about what they heard. And that, again, to the point of what do we look at in the coming days? Tariffs may be one of those open questions, Major.
I'm extremely glad I did not anger Anthony Salvanto. Ladies and gentlemen, you just simply don't want to do it. Anthony, thank you, my friend.
Thank you.
President Trump spent a great deal of time last night discussing immigration and what he called a very aggressive federal crackdown. Next, we'll speak with Congressman Gabe Evans, Colorado Republican, has pushed back against his state's sanctuary policies. You're watching America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. President Trump talked about his administration's record on immigration last night during his joint address to Congress, and he said he had implemented, quote, the most sweeping border and immigration crackdown in American history.
The media and our friends in the Democrat Party kept saying we needed new legislation. We must have legislation to secure the border. But it turned out that all we really needed was a new president.
Republican Congressman Gabe Evans joins me now. He represents Colorado's 8th Congressional District. Sir, it's good to have you with us. I want to play for you and our audience something you're familiar with. It was from a House Oversight Committee hearing today. There was a presentation by Denver's mayor, Mike Johnston, and then a response from you. Let's play those sound bites back to back.
There is not a single migrant encampment left in the city. We have closed all of our shelters. We have connected people to jobs and housing, and the city's immigrant support budget has dropped by nearly 90%. And in the midst of this, migrants did not bring a wave of crime to Denver. In fact, crime went down.
The statistics that we've gone through in the space of crime show why Denver is specifically cratering in their public safety statistics as compared to major cities around the country.
That's just actually false.
I can show you my statistics.
So, Congressman, what are your statistics? Is it just about what the crime rate is in Denver or how it compares with other major cities?
Yeah, so I was a police officer in the Denver metro area for over 10 years. That's a big piece of why I'm in Congress right now, is because I saw the failed policies of leftist leaders like Denver Mayor Mike Johnson. The numbers are, depending on whose database you look at, in Denver this last year there were 65 to 71 homicides. San Francisco, by contrast, a very similarly sized city, had half of that number in terms of homicides. Just 6 years ago, Denver didn't even make the list as far as top 50 most dangerous cities in the country. This year, Denver is currently ranked the 10th most dangerous city in the country. And a huge component of that is the fact that Denver is a sanctuary for violent criminal organizations that are illegally operating in Denver and in Colorado, like the Sinaloa cartel, like the Jalisco cartel, and like Tren de Aragua.
And you have legislation to either take away, if I understand it correctly, or give the federal government more authority in regards to sanctuary state policies and sanctuary city policies in Colorado. Is that correct?
Yeah, so in Denver and in Colorado, state and local law enforcement are not allowed to coordinate with their federal counterparts. As we heard Denver Mayor Mike Johnson say today, even when there are criminal arrests that were made, that was my line of questioning to him was, as a police officer, I know that these standard FBI fingerprint cards, which are taken in custodial arrests, have blocks on there where the question is asked, where was the place of birth and what is the citizenship of the person being arrested? And we've heard that Denver does not fill out those blocks, which then begs the question, how are we going to get violent criminals who have been arrested by Denver Police Department out of the community if Denver does not comply with basic data collection as required by the FBI and a whole host of other issues? We've heard in testimony today how the Denver jails won't hold violent Tren de Aragua members. And so what my legislation, the Uplift Act, does is it breaks down those barriers and it allows state and local law enforcement to be able to work with their federal counterparts to make sure that these violent criminals are identified and removed from our communities.
I want to ask you about something else that was publicized today. A memo at the Veterans Administration suggesting that there would be job cuts of up to 83,000 in the Veterans Administration workforce, taking it back essentially to its size in 2019, before the PACT Act was passed and people were hired in order to administer the benefits therein. Are you comfortable with reductions in workforce at the Veterans Administration of that size?
So I spent 12 years in the U.S. Army. Clearly, I am a military veteran. I come from a long line of military service members. And the question that we need to be asking here is, how do we make sure that we are most efficiently providing the critical services that our veterans deserve and are entitled to? And just this morning, I actually sat down with a major national veteran service organization, and I asked them those specific questions. Have we seen services to veterans interrupted? Have we seen any of those services impaired? And what they told me is that while there's a lot of noise in this space, they have not seen any services to veterans that have been impaired or impacted by this. And as my standard request is always, I ask them, if you hear of any specific situations where benefits directly to veterans are interrupted, please let me know so that we can find out how to prevent that from happening again. But as of just this morning, when I met with major veteran service organizations, they told me they are not aware of any impacts to services to veterans.
Right, but that is before a potential reduction in workforce of 83,000. Are you confident there'll be no loss of services if you take 83,000 veterans or employees out of the Veterans Administration?
The goal, again, is to make sure that our veterans are receiving the benefits to which they are entitled and that they are receiving those as efficiently and as quickly as possible. And so that's something that I'm committed to. That's actually something where I have co-sponsored legislation to make sure that we are preserving the ability of our veterans to receive those services.
Congressman Gabe Evans, thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Well, there's no question President Trump's tariffs on Canada will hurt us. They will also hurt Americans.
He's head of Canada's largest province now. Ontario's Doug Ford is talking about the president's, that is to say, President Trump's tariffs. He spoke to America Decides today. Part of that conversation coming your way next. Welcome back. The head of the Canadian province of Ontario is, listen to this, threatening to cut off electricity exports to the United States. Premier Doug Ford says he will turn off the power supply to 3 U.S. states, this in protest of President Trump's recently imposed tariffs. Ford's government is already committed to applying a 25% surcharge on energy exports to New York, Michigan, and Minnesota. CBS News correspondent Chanel Call spoke to the Ontario Premier late this afternoon and joins me now. Chanel, great to see you. So as I understand it, Ontario, largest manufacturer of car parts in Canada. What impact could this 30-day delay in the tariffs on those auto parts have?
Well, Major, great to be with you. I mean, the Premier has been vocal about this issue of automotive tariffs leading up to this announcement today about this pause. Basically, he says it's going to hurt people on both sides of the border. And that's because car plants here in the U.S. heavily rely on parts from Canada and Mexico. And the way this works, explained by Olivia earlier today as well, is that these parts will go back and forth several times before a car is actually made and sold here in the U.S. And essentially what that means is the price of these cars could skyrocket if the parts keep getting slapped with tariffs every time they cross the border. So I spoke to the Premier about what this 1-month pause means today. He said, leading up to this announcement from the White House, he had a phone call with Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick. He believes that phone call, at least in part, played a part, that is, in this 1-month pause. Listen.
The tone is, nothing's for sure right now, and that's very concerning. You know, as I always say, the only country that's benefiting from this squabble, if you want to call it that way, that is China. You know, as China is flooding markets around the world, undercutting American and Canadian workers, and they're sitting back laughing, watching the two closest friends and allies fight a tariff war.
So, Major, in case you're wondering why a Premier of Ontario has a seat at the bargaining table during these trade discussions, it's because Ontario is super important. The Premier of Ontario is sort of like a governor here in the U.S., but Ontario is key because it's such a huge trade partner with the U.S. It is the nation's largest economy in Canada, home to some pretty big industries, not just automotive, but manufacturing and technology as well. It is also super populated. 40% of Canadians live in Ontario.
So, Chanel, Ontario can play a big role in this, not just conceptually, but economically, practically. What other steps is the premier either thinking about or already set in motion?
Well, he's already committed to banning American companies from bidding on Ontario infrastructure projects, also removing American alcohol from store shelves. We've already seen this happen today, and canceling a $100 million deal with Elon Musk's Starlink internet provider. And he says he is open to cutting off electricity to 3 bordering American states. Listen.
As President Trump is, trying to get his tax cuts and other areas, he's really just creating chaos. There's one person responsible for that, and that's President Trump.
And, Major, I spent a decade covering politics in Canada before moving to the U.S., and I have to say, this is extraordinarily spicy, what we're seeing, this rhetoric in Canadian politics. We saw Premier Ford the last couple of weeks wearing this hat that reads Canada Not for Sale. He's been doing that at recent news conferences, and it comes on the heels of his re-election in Ontario, where a lot of people say he may have won because of this tough on Trump stance. We also heard from Prime Minister Justin Trudeau yesterday using really blunt and curt language. He actually also addressed the President, Donald Trump, by his first name, Donald.
And Chanel, based on your experience covering Canadian politics, does this feel to you like maybe not a tipping point, but a sort of reassessment across Canada about its relationship with the United States, and if not the United States generally, with the Trump administration specifically?
The timing here is so key because historically these two nations have been so intertwined culturally and, of course, economically as well. And we are starting to see a divide. I think, I'm hearing anecdotally a lot of Americans do think this notion of Canada becoming a 51st state may be a joke. But Canadians, many of them are not receiving it this way. A lot of people are taking this as a serious threat. As a result, we're seeing a lot of nationalism sort of emerge in Canada. And if you ask how, you might remember there were a lot of boos to the American national anthem at the last couple of big sports events between the two countries. There are also Canadians who are now boycotting American goods. And, Major, there are tons of Canadians who will ordinarily come to Florida to spend the winter here. They are not doing that this year.
Great perspective and reporting. Chanel Call, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Well, the president gave a speech to a joint session. That's pretty typical. But a Democratic congressman, for the first time ever, was kicked out. Several others walked out. Not typical. Our reporter panel will evaluate that and much more. That's next. You're watching America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. Thanks for hanging around with us. It is never easy to deliver the opposition party's response to a presidential address to Congress. Never, never, never. And it fell to Alyssa Slotkin, freshman senator from Michigan, to take up that task last night. As she mentioned right off the top, she is a former CIA analyst. She also won a very hotly contested Senate race in Michigan. And that made her, in the minds of some Democrats, at least a potential rising star in the party after the sort of rubble that was left by the 2024 election across many other states. In her response, Senator Slotkin talked not praiseworthy in non-praiseworthy ways about President Trump's economic policies. Let's listen.
The president talked a big game on the economy, but it's always important to read the fine print. President Trump is trying to deliver an unprecedented giveaway to his billionaire friends. He's on the hunt to find trillions of dollars to pass along to the wealthiest in America.
I want to bring in our political reporter panel. Kadia Goba and Kate Sullivan join me here at the table. Kadia covers politics at Semaphore. Kate covers the White House for Bloomberg News. Great to have you both with us. So we set it up with Slotkin, but look, the president was the driver of the entire conversation last night. Kadia, your takeaways?
Yeah, I was in the chamber last night.
How was it?
Interesting.
No doubt. That is one word. Yes, that's probably the most diplomatic word. It was feisty, very feisty.
Very feisty. I haven't seen such a coordinated protest from either side since I've been covering it since 2019. And I've been to plenty of those State of the Union.
And kind of members getting each other's faces and stuff?
I mean, it started at the very beginning when Melanie Stansbury was holding up a sign that says, "This is not normal," and her Republican colleague on the other side reached across the aisle, like right in the back of Donald Trump or in the front of him, and his name is Lance Gooden, and snatched it out of her hand. So it started from that.
Right.
And then in a very rare moment, because you are not supposed to display signs in the chamber, Democrats just started holding up signs that said, pushing back against false, Elon steal, or must steal, things like that, or save Medicaid. And it was just extremely coordinated. Some people who I would not have expected on the Democratic side to do things like that were front and center. And who could miss Representative Al Green?
No one.
Who stood up and, essentially said, you do not have a mandate against Medicaid, and was thereafter escorted out of the chamber.
And Kate, that really did set things off on a very raucous start. President Trump kept steamrolling ahead. He didn't acknowledge Congressman Green. Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, warned him a couple of times, and then used the powers invested in the Speaker to clear the chamber of disturbances because decorum is called for, and that's what happened. And Al Green said today he had no regrets.
That's right. And I think Democrats are really struggling to figure out how best to respond to Trump, and I think you saw that on full display last night. I think that there are people within the Democratic base who want to see that kind of action from their member of Congress. I think they want to see the protests. They want to see that their representative is really fighting for them. They want to see that passion. They say that this is a really unprecedented, drastic moment, and they want their member of Congress to really meet that moment. But I think at the same time, there are some real questions about how effective is this really ultimately, and what is actually going to get done? And if you're getting thrown out of the chamber, what now? What comes next? So, Schumer was asked about Al Green the moment today, and he said he essentially deflected answering whether he thought that was a good, which is unsurprising from leadership, right? But he said, the best answer is to organize. So I think you're seeing Democrats really struggle with this push and pull of we want to, protest and show our people that we're fighting for them, but also we really want to get things done and we want to have policy enacted, which is really difficult right now with Trump in the White House and the Republicans controlling the House and the Senate.
There are two ways of thinking about this. Al Green is not a power broker in the House Democratic Caucus. It's a one-off, and you should set it aside because it's just a one-off, kind of a carnival distraction. At another level, and I want both of your opinions on this, I think there's some connective tissue between Joe Wilson saying to President Obama when he was giving his speech to the Joint Session, "You lie," screaming that out loud to the President of the United States. That was like the first time a ripple from the floor of the House up to the President ever occurred in modern time. And it shocked everyone because those Republicans, like Joe Wilson, thought there was something transformational going on with the Obama administration, and they were frightened of it, did not like it politically. That's essentially what Al Green was doing as well. Democrats are frightened by the transformation, talked about in that speech by President Trump, emphasized over and over, and they are wanting to find a way to vocalize that fear. What do you think of that?
Listen, things are changing. There is a shift in the political landscape.
Joe Wilson's a Republican, Al Green a Democrat. My only point is both feel threatened and took unusual means by which to express their opposition or anxiety about what they fear is coming at them.
Yeah, I talked to Representative Stutzman, who hasn't been in Congress for many years and then was reelected, and he was, in awe of how different things are from the days of Joe Wilson when that was considered
a massively shocking moment.
Extremely shocking, and now, there's this massive protest with signage in the House. But I will add that Al Green, he was the first to announce an impeachment resolution way back in the first administration, and now he's the first to do it this time. Leadership does not support this. They understand that this is not the way, and they've actually been vocal about it. I think many Democrats are looking towards Slotkin as the answer. Something a little more calculated. She was very good at articulating their issues in plain language, but also talking about a resolution. She told them to organize and gave them instruction on how they should.
And she also said, don't check out.
That's right.
And we're not going to either, just in case you're curious. Kadia Goba, Kate Sullivan, thank you so much for being with us. I appreciate it. President Trump's pick to run the National Institutes of Health appeared on Capitol Hill today for a Senate confirmation hearing. That doctor, Jay, okay, help me out. Bhattacharya, there we go. I did it on live television. Give me credit. He has notably and publicly opposed stay-at-home orders back during the COVID pandemic. During today's hearing, he praised Florida's response to the virus and claimed that his views then had been censored.
Florida's response to the pandemic was a tremendous success. The root problem was that people who had alternative ideas were suppressed. I personally was subject to censorship by the actions of the Biden administration during the pandemic. Science, to succeed, needs free speech.
Alexander Tin joins me now. Alex, what else happened that caught your eye or ear at the confirmation hearing?
Yeah, Major, you know, in a different timeline, that role that he played in the COVID pandemic and advising Florida's response and having some of those so-called contrarian ideas to how to address the pandemic would have been a major focus of today's hearing. But instead, what we heard a lot, not just from Democrats, but actually from some Republicans too, like Maine Senator Susan Collins, as well as a number of Democrats, was a real concern about the changes that the Trump administration has done to the NIH ahead of Dr. Bhattacharya being potentially confirmed to his new role. And what you heard time and time again, and I actually want to take a listen to how he answered one of those questions, is you heard him say that he was not the one who made those decisions, but he would potentially reconsider them.
Do you support the recent researcher firings and grant freezes that have been implemented by Trump and Doge?
Senator, I was not involved in those decisions. If I'm confirmed as NIH director, I fully commit to making sure that all the scientists at the NIH and the scientists that the NIH supports have the resources they need to meet the mission of the NIH, which is to make America, do research to make America healthy.
Yeah, and look, if you had taken a recording of what he said there and just played it back again and again during the hearing, that's roughly what it sounded like in the actual hearing room. Him saying that he would commit to the NIH having the resources it needed, as he said, but also not giving any details or any real commitments of whether he would reverse the controversial probationary firings, the controversial changes to how health research is funded, and the controversial changes to cutting the amount of health research money that many institutions are getting, which is now in the courts, and today got another stay, preliminary injunction pausing that change.
With so many details for us, as always, Alex Tin, thank you very much. He's an ally of AOC and now challenging Nancy Pelosi in California's congressional primary. Next, we'll speak with a candidate who's calling for a new generation of Democratic leaders. That's next, right here on America Decides. Welcome back. Nancy Pelosi, by any measure, is a historic figure within the Democratic Party, and she played an outsized role this summer in coaxing, if not pressuring, President Biden to abandon his bid for re-election. Now she's facing a primary challenge from someone who helped progressive Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, AOC as she's known here in D.C., win her seat in Congress. Shoykat Chakrabarti is looking to unseat Speaker Emerita Pelosi in California's 11th congressional district, which, as most of you may know, includes most of San Francisco. Pelosi has been in Congress since 1987 and the only woman to be elected not once, but twice as Speaker of the House. Shoykat, it's great to have you with us. Why is it now that Pelosi needs to be defeated and her congressional career ended?
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Nancy Pelosi has had this seat for about 20 terms now. She first got elected when I was a one-year-old baby. And, the thing that's changed is I heard her on an interview after Donald Trump got elected in 2024. And, she's no longer the Speaker of the House, but she's still got considerable sway within the caucus. And her analysis of the situation was Democrats didn't really do anything wrong. We don't need to change anything. And then I saw how she used her sway. There's this seat on the House Oversight, the Oversight Committee, the chairmanship of the Oversight Committee, where AOC was running for it. And this committee, as you know, is sort of the chief communications organ for the Democrats. It's the main body that holds the Trump administration accountable and does kind of messaging. And whatever you think of AOC, you've got to give it to her. She's an incredible communicator. Well, Nancy Pelosi used her considerable weight to push aside AOC, and this is what the reporting was saying, and get Jerry Connolly, a kind of a loyalist to her, installed. And nothing against Jerry Connolly, I'm sure he's a nice person, but it just showed me that I don't think the Democrats really understand why people voted for Trump this time. Why did they vote for Trump in 2016? I actually believe that the people are voting for change over and over again. I think the Democrats have got to do things completely differently, both to fight Trump right now, but more than that, to pitch a kind of transformative economic agenda for the American people to vote for.
Define that transformative economic agenda in 1 or 2 points, if you could.
Yeah, well, I'll say why first, because I think that's an important part. I think for decades, both parties have been ignoring the biggest problems most people are facing. And what I mean by that is for most Americans, their wages have been stagnating or barely creeping up, while the big things you use to make a life, you buy a house, childcare to raise a family, get a good education, go to a doctor, those things have been skyrocketing. And so people just feel stuck. And people look at DC, and DC is completely stuck. DC is not tackling these big problems. So the result is people have been voting for change for over and over again. I think that was Obama in 2008. I think that was Trump in 2016, Trump again just now. People are open to the kind of change, but they just know that the business as usual is not cutting it. So what should it be? I think part of it is, a better social safety net, the kind of stuff Bernie and AOC talk about, guarantee universal health care, things like that. But beyond that, I think what we really need to be talking about is how do you do a massive investment into high-wage industries, into communities and cities all across the town to build millions of homes, to build the industries we need to build the infrastructure we need to build, to do the kind of massive economic transformation that FDR did when he built the middle class. It wasn't just a little iterative step. Through the FDR and the New Deal movement was able to beat back the right-wing movement of that time by showing that liberal democracy could actually deliver and deliver in a huge way. It changed people's lives for decades. It built the industrial base of this country for decades, and it kept the far right from taking power again for decades as a result of that.
Shortcut, I've got less than a minute. How does immigration fit into this? AOC, very hostile to ICE and federal immigration enforcement. That is a huge issue for Trump. We heard all about it last night. What is your economic or vision for immigration?
So I believe that when we're a growing country and we're a country that's actually building and doing a bunch, we should be inviting immigrants to come in legally and through safe means. That's the American system. That's how my dad came to this country. He got recruited. It's hard to imagine now, but back in the day, after we built the interstate highway system, after we sent a person on the moon, we were growing and building at such a pace. We were going around the world recruiting people to come to America to build this great country with us. And that's, in my vision, where immigration should be. So yes, we should be expanding legal immigration, but we do have to get control of the border, and we need to give people opportunities to legally and quickly and safely come to this country.
Shortcut Chakrabarti, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it. President's new Secretary of Education is already clearing the way to dismantle the department she runs. Next, Linda McMahon's first 2 days at the helm and what she is touting as her, quote, final mission there. That's next. You're watching America Decides. Welcome back. In her first week as Secretary of Education, Linda McMahon is wasting absolutely no time working to fulfill President Trump's wish to dismantle the very department she is heading. In a message to staff, McMahon said she was in the process of carrying out, and she wanted those in the department to help her carry out, quote, its final mission. Erica Meltzer is here now. She is the national editor for Chalkbeat. Chalkbeat is a nonprofit news organization that covers education. Erica, it's great to have you with us. So the federal government spends a lot of money. 4% of last year's budget went to the Department of Education. We have a graphic that shows most of what the Department of Education spends its money on. It's student loans, it's elementary and secondary education, special education, and post-secondary education. How much of that, Erica, could in fact Linda McMahon dismantle?
This is a really hard question to answer. Legally speaking, almost everything would require congressional approval, but there's a lot of concern with the way the administration has operated, that we could see funding cuts. that we, of course, also have a major budget battle going on the Hill, where Republicans are looking for money to pay for President Trump's tax cuts. And so there's a lot of fear of what could happen down the road to funding that a lot of schools rely on.
And it's my understanding, Erica, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that in terms of elementary and secondary education from the Federal Department of Education and special education, in many instances, states rely on that federal support to buttress their own education spending and to balance their own state budgets, correct?
Absolutely. Overall, federal funding accounts for about 10% of K-12 funding, but it's a much higher percentage in some high poverty districts, and for special education and for extra services that students who are living in poverty, students who are English learners, students who have a variety of challenges outside of the classroom, that money is really essential to bolstering that local funding, even though local funding is and will continue to be the majority of K-12 spending.
And Erica, what does the research tell us about this federal spending on elementary and secondary education and special education? It's been my impression that, especially in the special education part, that money has been well spent and has created positive outcomes.
Absolutely. I don't think that schools could really provide the level of services that they currently do to special education students without this funding. Though it is worth mentioning that the federal government has never met its promised obligation. They owe billions and billions more to school districts than they have ever paid, and school districts are making up that difference. And in terms of the impact for high poverty students, this used to be something that was fairly debated in education research, but at this point, it's pretty widely accepted that more spending does make a difference. It's not always spent well, but in the large majority of cases, we do see a difference in outcomes, especially for high poverty students, when more money is spent.
And Erica, when I've heard Republicans asked about the future of special education funding, they say, well, we're not going to change that. That will just be paid for by the states. Is that practical?
You know, the states already feel like they don't have enough money. So I think if the existing federal money went away, it would definitely be felt. The other thing that we heard from Linda McMahon in her confirmation hearing is that these funding streams would be maintained, but that states would have more flexibility to spend it. And that might sound good. There's a lot of concern within the disability advocacy community that those so-called federal strings are actually civil rights protections for students. And so there's a lot of concerns that if it were managed differently from Washington, that it could be to the disadvantage of students.
And what about the future of student loans and Pell Grants? Can you carry those out without a Department of Education?
Well, they've discussed moving that to the Treasury Department, and there certainly are other loan programs within the federal government. I think it's really hard to say how that would look different, what the priorities would be. We certainly see that this administration is not as interested in student loan forgiveness, to put it mildly, as the previous administration. And so I think a lot of those repayment plans are going to be less generous. The public service loan forgiveness is going to be less generous. And we'll just have to see what the future of Pell Grants will be.
And very quickly, Erica, Congress would have to be a part of this evolution, would it not?
Yeah, almost. The Department of Education itself was created by Congress, but also almost all of its major functions are congressionally mandated, and money has been allocated to each of these specific programs. And so you couldn't just unilaterally change that without working with Congress. And at her confirmation hearing, Linda McMahon promised repeatedly that she would work with Congress. Obviously, sort of whether the administration has to spend money that's congressionally appropriated has been a major point of contention in all of these dramatic funding cuts and lawsuits. And so I think there is a reason that people are somewhat skeptical of that. But yes, she would have to work with Congress.
Erica Melter, thank you very much. I appreciate it. That does it for today. We'll be back with another edition of America Decides tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern. The Daily Report starts right now.